Lakeview family, good day to you wherever you find yourself watching this. I hope you are having a fantastic week and excited to again gather together. Summer Sundays are enjoyable as always and also kind of difficult. People are traveling, so we miss kind of the collective whole being together, but we understand it's all good. And that's part of the rhythm of our life. And so hopefully you are finding ways to stay connected to, most importantly, to God and to the person of Jesus in deep and intentional discipling relationships. That's the hope, our mission, right, as a church, to be disciples, make disciples, love our neighbors. And as we continue to be about the vision of the kingdom of God, that we would be that kind of people in our neighborhood and find ways to both grow as individuals following Jesus and encourage others to do the same. And recognizing within that life, the lifestyle of being together, of corporate worship, of God breathing us in on Sundays and drawing us together to be formed and shaped into the image of Christ for the sake of others and ourselves, to gather together in worship, to have a dialogue with God, right? To hear from Him through scriptures, through the Word opened up to us, through the gift of the meal together that we find as we come to the table of Christ, and then to respond in worship, respond in prayer, in gratitude and thanksgiving, respond in community and fellowship with one another, and respond by receiving and in participating in this meal of thanks that we close our service with, and then being sent to be that people. So I do hope you find life and really lean into this rhythm of the Christian life, right? That it is attached to something, and we worship something. Always, our hearts are drawn to love something, and we want that specific something to be God and to be Jesus, and to be a life by the Spirit, to be a sanctified life that is continually coming under and surrendering to the power and presence of the Spirit. I mean, those are the things in my mind that matter the most. And we're going to come and encounter that today as we continue the series through the Old Testament. We're looking really at the sequence of kings in the life of the people of Israel, which began with their request, right? We want a king so we can be like everyone else. And we've been on this quest really looking at this idea then of comparison, which ultimately, when it boils down to with what the people of Israel are doing, it was wanting to be like everyone else, comparing themselves as a people to the world around them, to the kingdoms around them, instead of really holding on to and staking their claim solely in their identity as the people of God, a covenant people, a people that God had covenanted with, who God had asked them to covenant with Him. Instead of holding that unique, peculiar identity, they wanted to be like everyone else, and it put them on this road, which really was the same road that humanity has been on since the garden, right? This idea of idolatry, of creating God in our own image, which boils down to, you hear me say this often, it's choosing God or choosing other than God. I mean, it really is that simple. And when we choose other than God, we are on the path of idolatry, where identity is wrapped up in something other than God, and then we begin to roll down this road of being people that are oriented around loves that are other than God, that are other than the person of Jesus, that are other than living a way that reflects and looks like the kingdom. And both of these views really come headstrong in the person of David, in his rise that we've kind of followed and tracked in these last few weeks, his rise to being king, and to being not just any king, but to being, as God would say, my king, right? This Davidic line that we know, because we're 21st century folks who have the New Testament, that from this Davidic line, right, comes the person of Jesus. So what God is doing in raising up my king is He's establishing the line of David, the house of David, that will rule and reign in ways according to God's covenant. Now, we know, because we also know the story, and for those that are tracking on the Bible reading throughout the year, this chronological view, we're in the middle of the Kings, and it's depressing, man. It's sad. I won't digress, but for those that are following along, it's just hard. But in the midst of that, we learn this, and we know this, that through David and the line of David, we know this, that God is faithful, that God keeps his promises. And we can't let go of that. Now I'm going to touch on and talk about mystery a little bit, because there's a whole lot of things, especially when we're spending time in the Old Testament, that are just hard, right? That this idea of this is the kind of promises that God keeps, or the way that God works out God's promises. It's a wrestling match. It's a struggle bus. And that's okay. When you feel those things, I want you to feel those. I want you to express those and know that God has big enough shoulders to handle all of your tough questions. And oftentimes as Christians, we don't give God enough credit. And really what that means is that we don't know God. Because if that is our understanding of God, and we don't feel like we can bring those questions to God, or that something will happen, or that they're unanswerable, or we just like the answer that is not a loving God that we want to serve, like we've officially created God in our own image. We have gone the path of other than God, of idolatry. And not just like carte blanche, but that is the path that it leads on. And again, it doesn't mean that we just carte blanche, like, oh, God is good, and we give kind of this blind faith to the person of God and his story. But it's recognizing that there's a point where we as humans can't grasp all that is the divine. And I'll talk more about on Sunday, this idea of mystery, which I like to. It's funny, I was talking to Donna about this week, and we'll probably reference her in the sermon. But the idea of mystery is hard for people. And for me, what's helpful is recognizing it as and you've heard me say this before, that God is endlessly knowable. So it's not that God I can never fully understand. And really, it reminds us the quest shouldn't be to understand, because once we understand, we're eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. We're like Adam and Eve. We're trying to understand or be like God, which again is idolatry. It's creating God in our own image. But this idea of covenant relationship, of faithfulness, recognizing God's faithfulness to us, his faithful presence, and covenanting to obey and to walk out in obedience, is recognizing that I want to know God, and in knowing God, that there's a sense that God is endlessly knowable. It doesn't mean that I will never know, but it means the growth of knowing and understanding who God is at the core, not to understand so that I finally have all of God, of what I believe about God in a box, but knowing God intimately and God knowing me. And we see that in the person of David, and we've talked about it, that there's something unique about his time as a shepherd boy and the forming and shaping of who he was, and his reliance and faith on God, and his covenant relationship with God, and his capacity to align his will and walk that out in obedience. And when we see this rise, there's bookends in this chapter, this short passage that we'll read on Sunday, where all of Israel comes to David. We want you to be king, and we recognize that God has called you to be the shepherd king to lead all of Israel. And that shepherd language in the Hebrew really is talking about a king or a political leader or ruler. But there's something unique about the reference of shepherd king, and that David as shepherd king is God's king. So there's something unique about the way in which David is living out of this covenant, both God's covenant to the people of Israel and David, and then David's covenant to be this kind of king. And we play that out. That looks a lot like what we've talked about in the last several weeks, of this idea of surrendered comparison. David was still king. He was still ruling. He was still conquering. So there's some incredible tension in here, but it is a surrendered comparison. Like, he is not trying to be a king to be like everyone else. He's trying to be faithful to who God's created and called him to be. And I love that. And the other bookend is that then David grows greater and greater, the NRSV says, or grows in more and more power, as the NIV states. And I think this is interesting, because when we start to begin to see power and greatness and growth of all of the wealth, and we see this with all the kings, there instantly becomes right behind that, I think what we see is unsurrendered comparison, where then that growth comes, the greatness comes, everything is awesome. And then it leads down this path of becoming like everyone else. And then in the coming chapters, we will begin to see some of this creep in. And David, I think, begins to become influenced by more of the other than God way. We see that throughout then the kings of Israel and Judah, the split of the kingdom, the movement to exile, which again folds back to what I'd said at the very beginning, that what we see is the God of promise, both a promise of blessing, of land, of descendants, and then also of destruction and corruption and exile. And so we see these things that again, I mentioned several weeks ago, this kind of Deuteronomistic narrative or theology that we see throughout Kings, in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, that what comes for the people of Israel is the result of how they do or do not live in covenant relationship with God. And that's the part where when we see that they walk out of obedience, then the consequences of that, and this is difficult because it feels like the consequences are directly at the hand of God, and this is where the endlessly knowable mystery portion of God is really hard for us as humans to grasp, because it's hard to understand the loving side of God in the midst of this. And those are things where we sit in that tension. I don't have red bow answers for you on that. And I think that's okay. And I think it's okay to together sit in that and to recognize that David was there, and David continued to then walk out in obedience to being who God called him to be. The prophets were there. Certainly we see that then through the person of Jesus and in the early church and all the way through, is what does it mean to hold faith in a God that at times we don't quite understand. So anyways, I'm excited for Sunday. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I'm sorry for the 12-minute video today. Blessings.